extreme partisanship, looting and rioting, marriage and birth rates are plummeting. If it isn't already obvious, we are living in a failed state, in the midst of a crisis of morality. How did we get to this point? Why are we so dysfunctional? I think that these are questions that deserve answers, so I am going to attempt to answer them. Political partisanship, crime, and the breakdown of the family are all examples of moral problems. Right now, Western countries are facing a moral crisis. This crisis is most pronounced in the United States. The United States is, both literally and figuratively, the most Western of the Western nations. Americans used to agree on things. Men and women didn't used to hate each other. Crime was not considered socially acceptable. So to figure out what went wrong, we ought to account for the history of morality in the West. Before I do that though, I need to explain a few concepts to you. Number 1. Biological human morality. Human beings evolved certain moral values that allowed them to succeed in competition against other groups of human beings. Philosophers from the classical era, while having no knowledge of evolution, understood that certain moral values were innate in human nature. Number 2. Telos. Telos is the purpose of a given thing. The telos of a knife would be to cut food. A golf club would have the telos of hitting golf balls. Number 3. Virtue. To act virtuously is to act with moral excellence. It usually involves walking the line between two extremes, both of which would be considered vices. For example, a virtuous man is brave. However, being either a coward or being reckless would be considered a vice. Number 4. Self-actualization. True happiness can only be gained by deep and significant personal accomplishments. Composing a great work of music, saving a life in the emergency room, raising a child to be a success, are all examples of self-actualization. Self-actualization is separate from fleeting simple pleasures, like having sex or drinking a beer. Now that we've covered these concepts, let's review the history of Western morality. Letter A. Classical Western morality. Classical Western philosophy had a moral consensus about the purpose and value of human lives. Pretty much everyone back then agreed on the following points. Number 1. Human beings have a purpose, or a telos, which takes the form of deep human happiness and satisfaction with life. Number 2. To achieve happiness, human beings need to embrace their own humanity. This involves recognizing and being faithful to our biologically derived human morality. Number 3. Virtue was considered to be the telos of human beings. Through virtue, human beings could become deeply satisfied with their lives. The human virtues were also derived from our evolved biological nature. Number 4. Our human morality and virtue justifies our position at the top of the hierarchy of nature. We deserve our dominant position over plants and animals because of our virtuous behavior. Number 5. In addition to our innate morality, we also have intelligence. Our intelligence allows us to use critical thinking to evaluate moral claims and ideas instead of just making knee-jerk reactions. This moral consensus was first arrived at in ancient Greece. It was later adopted by the entire Western world. The Roman Empire, to the Jews through Maimonides, Islamic philosophy also braced the concept of virtue. The classical Western view of morality ended up becoming encoded into the doctrine of the Catholic Church. This consensus spanned all the way from the islands of Great Britain to the edges of the Middle East. So what happened? According to the philosopher Leo Strauss, classic Western morality was challenged by 3 successive waves of modern moral thinking. Letter B, the first wave, liberalism. With increases in literacy and printing technology, knowledge began to spread rapidly in the West during the 18th century. The Catholic Church had increasingly become corrupt due to its monopoly on knowledge. As a result, it soon found itself under attack by the Protestants. Many philosophers from this period of time, such as Sir Francis Bacon or Machiavelli, called for a new moral order. This new order would abandon the idea of virtue and permit man's total domination over nature. The idea was for people to treat land as property they could do anything they wanted with. In dealing with conflicts between individual people, these new philosophers stressed that it was not virtue that would mediate these conflicts. Instead, these conflicts would be dealt with through individual rights. People were allowed to do anything they wanted with their property, but they could not deprive the rights of other people. The problem with this first wave was they had no conception of morality. Anything was ethical so long as you respected other people's property rights. If you've ever seen a libertarian debate ethics, you've seen how bankrupt liberalism is in terms of morality. In such debates, libertarians will often try and act as if property rights are a form of morality. This is, of course, ridiculous. Letter C, the second wave, progressivism. The first wave generated enormous wealth, but also massive inequalities. While owners lived lives of luxury, workers struggled working in dangerous factories while living in crowded tenements. The immorality of liberalism prompted many reformers to adopt the label of progressives. Progressives would seek to make aspects of liberalism more fair and equitable to people. The most obvious injustice of liberalism was its tendency to generate massive amounts of inequality. Progressives who wanted to specifically address this problem adopted the label of socialist or communist. The early 20th century was defined largely between the conflict between those who adhered to the first wave versus the second wave. This culminated in the Russian Civil War, in which Russian communists overthrew a liberal democratic government. D, the third wave, the overman. The intellectual leader of the third wave was a German philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche believed that the West had arrived at a very bad place in time. Through liberalism, Nietzsche observed that mankind had alienated itself from nature. Due to this alienation, we can never return to a pre-modern lifestyle, where traditional human morality would allow people to live fulfilling lives. Furthermore, Nietzsche observed that we have to constantly worry about the efforts of the second-wave progressives to try and control or engineer us. In this regards, we have also become alienated from other human beings. To Nietzsche, the alienation of humans from both nature and other human beings has made our existence into a constant struggle. This struggle existed because second-wave progressives failed to solve the moral crisis of the West. Even if they eventually succeeded in helping the poor or redistributing wealth, the goal of human society has still been reduced to consumption and accumulating wealth. Self-actualization and virtue have been lost. Nietzsche indicated that there were 2 outcomes to this moral crisis. Number 1, the last man. You can choose to embrace or succumb to the moral nihilism of the first or second wave. By doing so, you become the last man. The last man is called the last man because he represents social decay and destruction. The West's low birth and marriage rates show the prevalence of both men and women who fall into the definition of Nietzsche's last man. Postmodernism could be fairly described as the ideology of the last man. Number 2. The Overman. The Overman, or in German, the Übermensch, also known as the third man, is someone who seizes control of both the liberal control over nature and the progressive control over people and creates a new morality. Now, Nietzsche's philosophy was intended for individual people. However, it became adopted by fascists as a justification for consolidating power behind a dictator. The hope was that a dictator would be able to rise to the level and become the overman. This could in turn solve the moral crisis of the West. Since Nietzsche predicted the rise of the overman, there have been 3 failed attempts. Number 1. Fascism. The fascist dictators Mussolini and Francisco Franco were the first to position themselves as an overman. However, while they established their own cults of personality, they failed to usher in a new shared Western morality backed up by an intellectual culture. Number 2. National Socialism. Adolf Hitler, perhaps more than any other, tried to rise to the level of the overman. However, Hitler not only failed to become the overman, he failed spectacularly. Not only did he fail to rise, he discredited the third wave entirely. To his supporters, his government was supposed to usher in a new moral order. Instead, it became the very symbol of immorality in the West. Warmongering and ethnic genocide became the legacy of Nazi Germany. Due to this, the first wave liberals would now have endless examples of why individual rights were necessary to prevent another rise of Nazis. Progressives would also have endless examples of why government control over people is necessary to ensure equality and racial tolerance. While the legacy of Hitler has created additional obstacles to the rise of the overman, it did not reduce the demand for one. Moral nihilism, accompanied by an endless battle between the liberals and progressives, is not appealing to most people. For many people, they don't want to join the ranks of the last man. They don't want to wallow around while their society decays around them. Number 3. The United States government. Those hoping for the rise of the overman put new hope in the government of the United States. The United States government, in fact, did come very close to rising as the overman. It did so through the Apollo 11 moon landing. This effort involves spending trillions of taxpayer dollars on an effort that advanced neither the goals or objectives of liberalism or progressivism. The moon landing showed that the U.S. government had accomplished the unimaginable. It had conquered both the factions of liberalism and progressivism and used them for another purpose. This showed the entire world that the U.S. government had the capability of rising to become the overman. As a result of this, many predicted that the United States would now go on to colonize space. In turn, people also believed the U.S. government would rise to the level of the overman and usher in a new moral order. The TV show Star Trek was based on this premise. The only problem is that the United States failed. We did not use the opportunity that we had to usher in a new moral order. As time went on, the United States squandered its potential to become the overman. In the late 60s, the United States ceded some of its power to second-wave progressives through the civil rights and Great Society welfare programs. Later in the 80s, the United States government ceded more of its power to first-wave liberals. It did this first by reducing the size of the government. Secondly, it created the infrastructure for globalization. The failure for an overman to rise has resulted in extreme societal decay. We are now all witnessing the breakdown of society in a complete moral crisis. First-wave liberals and second-wave progressives endlessly attack each other and blame each other for these problems. But neither ideology has any solutions. With these two movements lacking any shared conception of morality, they have no chance of solving our moral crisis. Letter E. The fourth wave. Renewal. We can't wait forever for the overman to rise. At this point, our civilization will crumble before that's even able to happen. Artificially creating the conditions that would allow the rise of an overman is also dangerous. We saw what happened when it came to Hitler or the fascists. Instead of using their authority to usher in a new morality, they exploited their position of power and acted immorally. Furthermore, if a potential overman rises, like the US government in the late 60s, it may eventually be overtaken by liberals and progressives. Such was the fate of the United States. The only solution to our moral crisis is a renewal. We need to return to the Western moral order that existed for thousands of years prior to liberalism. We need to return virtue to its rightful place as the shared morality of Western countries. A fourth wave of renewal is the only solution to the moral crisis we're currently stuck in. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please support small YouTube channels like mine by subscribing. Thank you.